This is Esports and the Law. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see everybody.
We are members of Legalese. We are a podcast group that consists of lawyers, law students, researching all sorts of legal issues and trying to break them down in a way that's easily digestible and easy to understand. So, our primary focus is to inform the public. Esports is a rapidly growing industry, and there's not a whole lot of information on it right now. There aren't a whole lot of lawyers that are looking at it, but it's something that needs to be researched because it's getting so big. Now, before we continue, I should inform you, even though the two of us did graduate from law school and we have legal training, we are just providing legal aid. We are providing legal information. We are not giving legal advice. Anything that's said here does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. If you have a legal issue that you need addressed, please consult an attorney.
Yeah, there are lots of great attorneys in Phoenix area and in California as well. If you have an issue specific to esports, by all means, contact one of them. We can even get you in touch potentially. But no actual legal advice is being given.
Right.
This is all just a very high-level overview of all the different issues that are currently present in the esports scene and how they are being addressed in general.
Right. So I think we're about ready to move on. Before we do, I'm just going to introduce myself. My name is Gabe Lim. I'm a recent graduate from ASU Law School. I got my certificate in Law, Science, and Technology. I actually did my dissertation on contract law as it pertains to minors in esports. So I've done my fair share. I've done my due diligence on at least some of it.
Sure. My name is Andrew Theory. I'm also a recent graduate of ASU Law. I did a lot of work with intellectual property, patents, copyrights, trademarks, that sort of thing. I wrote a paper on esports law with regards to antitrust issues, so governance and monopolization and all that sort of really boring stuff. But it had to do with video games, so that made it all worth it. And we're going to get started with a really quick video that Riot put out just to get you all to speed with the current state of esports, how it's generally perceived, and where it's headed in the future.
Isn't like watching people play football. It's like watching people play fantasy football. It is one more step removed from human activity. You understand? It's video games. It shouldn't be on a sports network. It's video games.
Saying it twice doesn't make your argument any more true.
How it truly be a spectator sport? It already is. 71 million watched it last year. I reckon it's going to by 2017 be 145 million people watching it.
They're actually giving college scholarships for video gaming. And it's even gone to the point that now the government has acknowledged professional video gamers as athletes.
You can hear the crowd, everyone's cheering the team on, you make friends, there's people you talk to, you play online. It's all about community, being part of something that you're incredibly passionate about.
Really glad that worked without any technical hiccups. an achievement in and of itself. All right, so that's a taste of what esports is. It's really, really huge. Even though you may not have heard much about it in this country, in other countries, especially in Asia and Europe, it's really big, and it's growing here. More and more people are watching it, both online and in person, and more companies are getting involved, either buying teams, investing directly that way through other teams or leagues, or sponsoring teams or leagues, and so doing so indirectly. And that's what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about, as the scene is growing, those sorts of legal issues that come up, what you all may need to know if you're interested in getting involved as either a player or organizing a team, or maybe even investing in some other way. We're here to provide that information for you today. All right, so first I'm going to talk a little bit about, broad strokes, what esports actually are. I've got a fancy graph here. I probably put more thought into this than I needed to, but just to give you an idea of all the different types of games that are being played competitively. Because an esport is a very difficult term to define. All sorts of games are being played competitively. I would consider pretty much all of them esports. They don't even have to be like multiplayer competitive games. They have speed runners. I would consider that a sport because you put in skill, you put in practice. It's very competitive. Who can get the fastest time in certain maps and certain levels and certain games. And so when you're thinking about what games can be esports, really it's any game that people enjoy enough to want to be good at and to want to prove that they're the best at. So I have some examples on this slide. You can see some pretty common ones, some mainstays like Dota 2, League of Legends, some maybe smaller ones like, I apologize, that's my virus protection letting me know that it's time to update. Not worried about that right now. You can see maybe some lesser known ones. A lot of sports games like NBA 2K and FIFA are less popular, but are definitely still fit the definition of games that can be played competitively. All right. There we go. And to give you a little bit of an idea about what the industry looks like from an industry standpoint, I've got a pyramid here of kind of the hierarchy. You can see that at the very top are the developers of the games. And this is what makes esports really unique and exciting. They're different from traditional sports in that the games are developed and therefore owned by specific companies. So you have the likes of Blizzard or Riot or Valve, who own all of the intellectual property that have gone into the games, like Hearthstone or Overwatch or CSGO or Dota 2. And that is a very interesting wrinkle that complicates a lot of these legal issues. So when you're talking about an esports league or an esports team, you always have to consider who the developer of the game is. You have to consider what their rights may be, because it's not like they could theoretically, and if it's an older game, they probably have already put the game into the public domain so that pretty much anybody can play it or broadcast it and not have to worry about the rights of the developer. But for most of the popular modern games, that's still a very real issue that you have to be aware of. Just below the developers, you have all of the organizers. These are companies that you've probably heard of, like ESL and MLG, DreamHack. These are companies that make their business organizing competitive esports play. A lot of times you'll see developers sort of blur that line as well. Like for instance, the Overwatch League is pretty much run by Blizzard, the developer of the game itself. So you see some crossover there, but at this point there are a good number of established companies that are in the business of organizing competitive esports play. And those competitive units, that this environment in which the teams and the players are able to compete, are the tournaments and the leagues. Again, the lines here are a little blurry. I mentioned the Overwatch League is pretty much the same as Blizzard. LCS is pretty much the same as Riot. The International TI is pretty much the same as Valve, well, more or less. And so those are the competitive environments where the teams and the players actually exist and where they actually compete. And sometimes those can be separate legal entities. Sometimes they can be, subsidiaries of a higher tier entity. Sometimes they can just be the same entity. But that's those differences there can be important. It's something you can think about. You want to chime in?
I mean, not really. Like, the leagues and the tournaments will set their own laws. The league championship series sets its own rules, which every team has to abide by. This is what we can call the soft law, even though it isn't codified by by some government. Everyone is obliged to follow by its rules, otherwise they can't compete.
Exactly.
This is important for those people who actually want to either organize a team or want to play professionally. I think we can move into other issues here. Should we move to the next slide?
I can just talk a little bit more about the lower tiers of this pyramid, because these are where we get into familiar territory for most people. Most people recognize team names, most people recognize player names, and those are at the bottom of the pyramid for a reason. The players are where the value of this entire industry is really derived from. You have their personalities, their own live streams where you can go and watch and support them directly. The reason why you would maybe support a team is because you really appreciate the players that make it up, or some other reason. And so that's where spectators and consumers enter the picture. Is because they're attached to a team or they're attached to a player. And that's important for sponsors and investors and all, because at the end of the day, that's how they make their money, through advertising to consumers. And so they're very aware of which teams are doing well, which players have the biggest personalities, the biggest social media followings, because that's where, at the grassroots level, the real value in the industry is derived from. So if you're thinking about getting into the industry as an investor or even as a league or a team owner, think about the players, because they will determine the overall success of your team or of your league.
Right.
So now that you've got a sort of high-level picture of what esports looks like, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of some legal topics. This is where we get excited, maybe not so much for you guys, but this is important. This is all really useful information, and it is interesting, because most of it is the same as traditional sports law, but there are some interesting wrinkles that throw things through a loop.
And if I may, actually, that's really the biggest overarching question here: whether esports are actually sports. Because the law in this country does not actually define what constitutes a sport. You could look for certain other areas like a dictionary, but you'll get like a bunch of different definitions. If we classify esports as a sport, then all the traditional rules of sports law apply, but then even then, what sort of protections they may be entitled to are still loose. Should I bring up the case study?
Let's wait on that. I've got a specific place where we can talk about that, but we do have some very interesting kind of horror stories to tell you guys. And those all come from when these legal principles break down. So when we talk about governance, that's about how leagues and teams are run, how they're operated, what rules are set for them, so that they don't, mistreat their players or take advantage of, their players or the teams in the league, and make sure everything is equitable and the relationships between those different entities. We talk about contracts a lot. The contracts issue is a pretty major one. We're not going to get too in the details on that one, but a lot of issues can come up when contracts break down, or when a contract is poorly written and it doesn't give adequate protections or rights to a specific party. The intellectual property and the licensing is important. I mentioned it in passing at the beginning, because you have to think about who owns the game, who owns the assets associated with it. You have to think about who owns the league or the tournament and all the promotional material associated with that. You have to think about who owns the team and their logo and their brand, because that's a whole separate thing, and they have their own sponsors that deal with that. And then that could extend all the way down to the players. The players have their own brands, their own personalities, their own likenesses. A lot of them have an internet presence outside of their team or their league. So, that's potentially different intellectual property that they own separately from their team or the league or the game that they play. Broadcasting and live streaming all factors into that. It's this really complex ecosystem of who owns what and who's allowed to broadcast what, and who gets what value from what stream or what tournament. All right, we're going to take a little bit of a break here because this is our third panelist who wasn't able to make it today. Hi, Mina.
Hi.
Hey, you're on mic.
Good time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, perfect. All right, so everyone can hear me.
Can you hear her okay?
Thank you for coming to our panel. I'm the founder of the podcast, and Gabe and Andrew have just been amazing pioneers for the podcast. They're really making it what it is now with regards to esports. I wish I could be here today, but I have to catch a flight in literally half an hour. It's perfect timing. And I won't take much of your time, but just as an intro to esports, I think it's such an amazing time that we live in. Everything's not only technological, but it's just spread across the whole globe. And I think that's what esports capitalizes on. You can stream yourself from your bedroom playing a game, and it's not just a game anymore. It's transformed into a sport. So the panel is really topical, and whether you're an investor in esports, an amateur gamer, or you want to be a pro gamer, this is the panel for you, because we try to navigate the waters of esports law, which is very new, and a lot of lawyers don't even know how to tackle it. So that's what me and my team try to do. We're trying to learn more about esports as we go along, and we already know, I think, more than most lawyers do, just because it's such a new topic, and we're spending time to do research and to present it to you guys here today. So I think that's all I have to say, Andrew.
All right, thanks, Mina.
Yeah, no problem.
All right, have a safe flight.
Have a great panel. Bye.
All right. All right, thanks for humoring us. We really wanted to be here, but she had a flight, and it didn't work out quite so well, so thank you for humoring us. All right, back to our list. We've got a couple really quick ones to touch on before we close out the presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about entity formation and investing. This is important because when forming a team or when forming a league, you need to know how you're going to set it up, what rights, what protections from liability you can make for yourself and for your players and for your teams. And this is important for investors too, because it governs who owns what percentage of your team or your league. It determines what kind of value is allocated to each of those owners, and again, how liability can be distributed if something terrible should happen. And then we've got some very topical issues. Very recently, some decisions were made about gambling issues, and skin gambling is a really, really topical issue. A lot of lawsuits are being thrown around with regards to that. And loot boxes. You've probably encountered some of these in real life, and the legal issues surrounding them can be, okay, Nina, stop texting me. All right. Can be very tricky. So let's get started.
Okay. First off, we're going to be talking about governance of esports. What regulates them? What's actually keeping them in check, and actually controlling how the game is played. Let's see. Do you want to talk about KESPA?
We'll have some slides on that later, but yeah, you could go into it.
Right. I think you're a little more knowledgeable.
Yeah, sure. So the Korean Esports Association is an actual government entity. Korea is at the forefront of a lot of these issues, and they have gone ahead and actually formed an official governmental entity that is tasked with regulating esports. This is leaps and bounds ahead of any other country, what any other country has done in any other context, and they've been able to provide a lot of oversight, a lot of stability to their players, their teams, and their leagues, which is really cool.
The other area which could be governing this is the NCAA, National Collegiate Athletics Association. Yeah. The NCAA outlines all the rules for college sports. At this time, it hasn't really taken in esports under its wing, but it might. And that has a lot of implications for young people who are going into esports. I mean, the majority of players are usually what, in their late teens, early 20s?
Mhm.
So they may be going through they might be going through their post-secondary education. This is huge because this could potentially affect how they're being compensated. College athletes don't get paid for their work. If the NCAA gets paid, if the NCAA takes in esports, what does it mean for those young people who go on to play professionally? Does that mean they're not entitled to any part of the prize pool? Does it mean they can only get scholarship money? We don't know yet. We'd have to see.
Okay. And I mentioned a little bit in my pyramid about how developers themselves are getting involved with the governance of the teams or the leagues or the tournaments that they set up themselves. And a lot of independent organizations have already entered the space and are making it their business. Some of them are for-profit, some of them are non-profit, but they have taken on these responsibilities of making sure that everyone is treated fairly and that all the rules that are being laid down are being followed. There are, again, some really interesting specific cases about government governance in esports that each of these parties is taking to kind of fill in the gaps and make sure that all the bases are being covered. I mentioned KESPA. They have partnered with an LA law firm, LPL, to make sure that all of their players get sufficient legal and financial advice and services. Riot has set up the North American LCS Players Association. It's not a players' union per se yet, but they want to head it in that direction, and so they've taken it upon themselves to elect, or not really elect, but they chose somebody who has a lot of experience governing traditional professional sports to head up this players association to hopefully give their players some more rights, to protect their rights, to protect their interests, and to make sure that they can succeed in their LCS league. And then Blizzard, I mentioned a couple times before, with their Overwatch League initiative. It's really cool to see what Blizzard is doing. They're doing a lot of great things for their players, such as salary floor across the board so that every player is guaranteed at least a certain amount of compensation for their work, requiring benefits for all of their players, requiring teams and franchises to have coaching and support staff and to provide housing for all the players. So really cool developments in the governance area. A lot of these companies are recognizing the importance of the players and making sure that systems are in place to protect their rights and their interests. And all of this matters. Governance matters because it's important for the players, it's important for the leagues and the teams, and it's important for the private sector as well. Sponsors want to make sure that the entities that they're investing in have that longevity, that they're not just going to implode or collapse because of the lack of oversight or lack of player morale or anything like that. And so having these structures in place is really a positive thing for esports as a whole. It gives a lot of rights and ensures fairness for the players themselves, as I've mentioned several times. Player visas is a really important issue and one where governments necessarily have to become involved when you talk about players moving to different countries to compete or visiting countries to participate in tournaments and events and all that. The U.S. government has been giving athletes visas to esports professionals, which is really cool to see. Part of the long process of legitimizing esports. And obviously, if a player wants to come to the U.S. to compete, they need to be able to enter the country legally. So another very specific example of why governance matters.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead and move on.
Right, and I briefly discussed collegiate esports here. Now that scholarships are being offered to professional Overwatch players, those same issues come up. Does the NCAA take charge? Does that mean that's the only money they can get? What does that mean for those people who want to continue playing professionally? The other big area where we get governance is the contract. A lot of horror stories here. You're dealing with people who are relatively young, who don't have experience negotiating contracts. You're dealing with people who essentially sign their souls away for a number of years for, what, like $100? I've seen someone complaining on Twitter about being signed onto a contract for, I believe it was Counter-Strike, and he basically, got a $100 salary and a 4-year contract.
Yeah, so that's a problem. That's where, when contracts law breaks down, when the documents aren't written well, players can be taken advantage of. It's a really common thing, unfortunately. But we also see a lot of improvements in this area. A couple of years ago, Riot revamped their entire contract structure to make sure that players couldn't be locked into teams for longer than 3 years and could easily move between the teams. We talk about the non-compete clause. That's a really important clause that, if you include it in your contract, means that the players aren't allowed to participate on other teams outside of yours. And that can even perpetuate after they've left your team. So you can imagine how a player could easily get stuck, not having an outlet to play, to compete, and to make a living. And so Riot got rid of all of that from all of their contracts in this revamp. And a bunch of other industry improvements that we've seen over the years and that you need to be thinking about, making sure that the teams and the leagues don't limit their own liability in case something happens to a player, or a player does something and hurts someone else. You don't want all of that fault falling on the player necessarily, because the team or the league could be responsible to some extent. We're talking about the collective bargaining agreements, which we haven't seen a whole lot of yet. Again, this is when we would talk about a player union. That doesn't exist yet, but we're moving in that direction very slowly but surely. Intellectual property rights of the players being respected more and more. This means players being able to stream on their own, being able to have their own online presence and personality on social media outside of the team and unconnected from the team. That's really important, and that's something we're seeing more and more. And any other competition that may come up, because a league or even a developer, they all compete with each other. Whether you play League of Legends or Dota, or watch League of Legends or Dota, that's a real thing that they're worried about. And so, if a player leaves a team, they should be able to, move to a different team or move to a different game without having to worry about competing against their former employer or the former developer whose game they played before. So those are all directions that we're seeing contracts go in that are really positive for the scene. I can talk a little bit about intellectual property too, because that's a lot of my background. There's a lot of it. We're talking not so much about physical property that you can hold and that you can see. We're talking about your online social media presence, your likeness. Whether your face, if you're a successful player, can be used by a team or by a league in their promotional material. That's all stuff that you have to think about when you're writing the contracts or when you are making an agreement to play in a league. A lot of players have their own live streams. I've talked a lot about this. There are a lot of intellectual property assets that go into there. If you've ever watched a stream, it can be something really rudimentary like the one I'm running right now on my laptop, or it can be something really complicated with a bunch of bells and whistles and subscriber notifications and text-to-speech and all this crazy stuff. And all of that is owned, whether it's by the streamer or if they've licensed it. Licensed is a fancy word for purchased for a certain amount of time to use for their own purposes from a third party, an artist or a developer or something like that. And then a really interesting issue is whether the gamer's identity online, their tag or their name that they go by, could be trademarkable or have some intrinsic value because it's representative of their brand to a certain degree. So that's something we have to think about as well. Whether the player reserves the rights to own that, whether that becomes property of the team that they've agreed to play for, whether the league and the developer can use that to promote the game or their own events or things like that. That's all stuff you have to think about. Intellectual property is really fascinating, and you can go really in depth on all of these issues.
Well, there's also the issues of live streaming rights. At the end of the day, those developers have the ultimate say so, like any other video game. You can't put you can't put clips of Mad World up on YouTube or on Twitch because those developers specifically didn't want that. I would imagine that Twitch, YouTube, Mixer, like by allowing those, that's how they get their money. And of course, these esports have a vested interest in allowing these streaming services to continue because it draws attention to their game. They could take it down if they wanted to, but they don't because it helps them.
It's a lot of free exposure potentially. We can talk a little bit more about live streaming with respect to broadcasting, because at the end of the day, you have to deliver all of this content to the consumers, to the viewers. And so we've seen recently a lot of this takes place online through streaming services like the one we mentioned in the previous slides, Twitch and YouTube and Mixer more being the prominent ones. But we're seeing recently a trend towards traditional linear broadcasting as well. So League of Legends and Riot signed a multi-year deal to broadcast their LCS series on ESPN+, which is ESPN's direct-to-consumer streaming service. So kind of in the same vein of Twitch and YouTube, but a more recognizable brand and a more recognizable delivery platform. And then the Overwatch League got a whole bunch of eyeballs on them a couple weekends ago with their grand finals. This was streamed on Twitch. They have an exclusive agreement for a couple years for Twitch to provide all of their content online, but also ESPN, Disney XD, and ABC even showed some highlight reels from the games, and that's a really cool direction to see things going in. That obviously legitimizes the scene and is the first exposure for a lot of non-endemic viewers to this sort of stuff. It's important to note that these agreements so far have been non-exclusive, so just because Overwatch League has an agreement with Twitch to live stream all of their games there, that doesn't prohibit them from going to ESPN or Disney or ABC and making a separate agreement to provide all of their content on a more linear platform, whether that be a subscription cable service or an online streaming service like ESPN+, or even just over-the-air broadcasting like ABC would be. That was a really cool event, the Overwatch Grand Finals. If you look closely, you can actually see me in that picture in the bottom right. It was really cool to be there, and really cool to hear afterwards about how many people actually were exposed to it for the first time and got to see a little bit of what we're all so excited about. You want to talk about this?
The corporate structure.
This is some more technical legal stuff. If you're thinking about starting a team or a league, you've got to think about
how you're incorporating it, where you're incorporating it. Each state has its own laws, so you'd want to think about where you'd want to do that. A lot of places tend to go with Delaware.
Delaware's a popular one because of their
because they're super relaxed when it comes to corporate governance and all those rules. This, of course, has tax consequences for how you organize your group.
So this is important if you want to be investing in an esports organization. You want to make sure whether their revenue is taxed once or twice and at what time. The liability of the leagues, I've talked a little bit about up in the contract section. The type of entity that you form determines in part what kind of things you can be held liable for. When lawyers talk about liability, we just talk about who gets in trouble for what.
Right.
So if something were to happen to a player, if a player were to, defame or offend somebody or do something to hurt a third party, it's a huge question about who's on the hook for all of that fault.
Right.
And then ownership. You talk about shareholders or members of an LLC. It's important to know who your owners are, because at the end of the day, they're going to be making a lot of the high-level decisions about how your league is operated, what teams are allowed to participate, how different issues with players are handled, and all of that. And so that all goes into the corporate structure when you have to think about a lot of that stuff up top when you're forming your team or your league. This can get really complicated because when we talk about a team like Cloud9 or Evil Geniuses or something, they could either operate in a single competitive space or they could operate across a whole bunch of different games and a whole bunch of different developers. So think about, what's a good example? I guess Cloud9 is a good example. They have teams in everything from Rocket League and CSGO to Overwatch and Hearthstone, all these very different, not super related areas, but they're, at the end of the day, all being run by the same parent organization. And so, when a sponsor approaches Cloud9, you have to think about, which specific teams, which specific subsidiaries of that team they want to get involved with, and all of that. So you talk about a lot of subsidiaries, a lot of affiliates, a lot of parent and shell companies for all of these sorts of things.
Right.
A little bit of economics for those of you who are so inclined. There is a lot of money in esports, no doubt about it, but it's often delayed. It's often uncertain. Performance-based payouts are really common, and it's uncertain for another reason, because you get revenue from a whole bunch of different sources. It's not like a traditional retail corporation where they sell a product and that's how they make their money. In an esports organization, you have to think about the winnings that your team may earn. You have to think about all the different sponsorships that they may garner. You have to think about the merchandise that they might sell, the live streams that they might show advertisements on, the marketability of their brand and of their players, because that all factors into it too. And at the end of the day, how many audience impressions how many people you actually reach, because that's what investors and advertisers are going to want to know.
Right. Esports gambling. Now I can talk about this one. Of course, this was going to be a huge issue. After all, a lot of children play video games. How many of us have run into a squeaker on Overwatch or League or somewhere else? I see your face. I know you run into them all the time.
Don't hit the player, hit the game.
Well, it's their fault we lost. If they just guarded the checkpoint like they were supposed to, you can't have 5 DPS in one team, I swear to God. Anyway.
We have very different ideologies on these sorts of things.
Yep, we agree to disagree, but this is why we lost. Anyway, where was I? Oh, that's right. Esports gambling, skin gambling in particular was a big one. CSGO had tradable weapon skins. You could turn the guns pink. Why wouldn't you want pink guns? They're awesome.
And it was a problem because they could be used as currency. There was a marketplace where you could cash out potentially and actually convert your in-game items and skins into money. Whether that be crypto or just American dollars. And so that's where the government stepped in and recognized that the use of these skins for gambling is a big issue, because there's potentially
before that,
real-world payouts.
Before that, CSGO, Valve actually stepped in and started placing a bunch of limits. For example, there was a grace period before you could retrade items. There were a number of websites that facilitated the trading of these skins. And Valve and Twitch have basically just said no more. That doesn't mean, however, that it's completely gone away. A future esport may come up and start reinstating it. The interesting thing is, as we were working, when we first presented this panel at Phoenix Comic Fest just a few weeks before, the Supreme Court actually decided that states had the authority to legalize betting on sports. If esports also falls under the umbrella of sports, that means states could also determine that betting on esports, skin gambling, totally legal. Of course, it raises that gives way to a bunch of other concerns as to whether those, whether squeakers, minors may gamble or may participate in this sort of activity. How do you enforce it? After all, if someone like Valve has a player base of children who are doing this, how do they crack down on it? Are they enabling underage gambling? Does the government need to step in? For some of these organizations, it might just be better to nip it in the bud. And they might do so by exerting what power they have to keep it from happening.
All right, Loot Crates. So raise your hand if you recognize any of these or have purchased them maybe in the past. Yeah, so turns out the legality of these things is still an open discussion in a lot of places.
Yep. In a lot of places, they haven't necessarily cracked down on this very much. Hawaii has been in the works of creating some legislation to prohibit games with loot crates extending to children under 18. This extends far beyond the scope of just esports. It, like the whole, if you don't mind me going on a tangent here, gacha games like Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, Grand Blue Fantasy, Fate Grand Order, Fire Emblem Heroes, right? Spending money on in-game currency to get those beautiful anime ladies. For the record, it's for the stats, not for the waifus. Just saying.
Keep telling yourself that.
Oh, get over yourself. Anyway, this has become an issue because now you have places like Belgium. Belgium has basically declared loot crates illegal. That cuts out an entire section of the European market. Does this mean that games that feature loot crates are no longer are basically unplayable there?
It's not really a new issue per se. Developers are already having to deal with regional differences in these sorts of regulations. In China, for example, it's required that each purchase of a random item give some base threshold of value. So for instance, when you buy a bunch of Overwatch loot boxes on a Chinese server, there's always a certain level of currency that's included with each one. I don't know the exact number, but it's whatever the government has required to say, if a player is paying for this random outcome, you have to ensure that they are given a certain level of value. So, they can't just be completely out of luck if they get something worthless or something other than what they wanted. So developers are going to have to be more and more aware of that as more and more places decide to regulate these sorts of random outcome value being given to players. But at the end of the day, it's a really effective business model. It's probably not going to go anywhere. Governments just need to decide how they're going to treat it. And it's kind of fun opening card packs. I love it.
The future of esports. Honestly, even though there's a lot of scary stuff out there, there's not a whole lot of governance when it comes to esports. You're dealing with people who are young, inexperienced with negotiating contracts, and they run into situations where it's easy to screw them over. Once they're in that contract which does screw them over, the government can't do anything, they can't take it to court. If they try to get out of it, they could get sued. It's ugly. However, we seem to be moving in a more positive direction. As these issues are starting to see the light of day, they're going to start gaining more attention in our lawmaking bodies, whether it be through the legislature or through the courts.
Yeah. There's been a lot of motion actually within the International Olympic Committee to get esports on the program. A lot of professional players, Gregory and Jake, I know, have met with the commissioners. Nate Nanzer, the commissioner of the Overwatch League himself, has talked to a lot of the council members about, including these virtual competitions alongside the rest of the competitive games being played there, which is a really cool thing to see. A lot of obviously it differs from country to country, but I would say the majority of countries have enough interest and could field teams potentially in a lot of these different competitive games. So it'd be really cool to see.
Right. The Asian Games, the second largest sports tournament next to the Olympics, has actually started to open up an esports branch in, I believe it's either 2018 or 2019. There's something to look forward to. That being said, shall we open the floor up for questions?
Yeah, that's all we've got. Thank you all for coming. So if you have any questions or concerns or need some clarification on something, let us know.
Yes?
All right, so earlier you mentioned the players union that Riot kind of helped put together.
Players Association. It's not a union yet. Yeah.
So getting to that.
Big difference.
Two-part question. How long do you think it will be before players will have a true union? And isn't it a conflict of interest for the actual developer themselves to help create a union, quote unquote?
That is certainly true. All the experts that I've talked to about this, have a lot of experience dealing with the players themselves, all have the same stories, and it's that unfortunately the players don't seem to care as much. They're all, as Gabe had mentioned a couple times, they're young, they're doing what they love. They tend to not want to have to worry about their legal rights or, any collective bargaining agreements or anything like that. They just want to play the games that they are being paid to play. And what really has to happen for a real union to form is that it has to be grassroots. It has to be the players or maybe veteran, retired players recognizing the need for some collective bargaining pushback against the developer or against the league and banding together under a common banner to accomplish that. Riot and Blizzard, to a lesser extent, are certainly, maybe politely suggesting the players to coax them in that direction, but hopefully soon the players themselves will step up to the plate and make something like that happen.
I'll try to be optimistic because so many horror stories have shown up on social media and more gamers are coming out and talking about it. I'm wondering if this means that the agents or coaches who are involved with these gamers might actually, take the initiative if they start coaching teams later on, and push the gamers into forming those unions. I think it, some might say it's a little bit Pollyanna-ish, but I mean, eventually there has to come a point where people are disgruntled enough that something has to change.
Yeah, the realist in me is worried that something terrible is going to have to happen. Some players are going to have to absolutely get run over by their org for them to finally come to realize the importance of having a union to stand up for their own rights. But the optimist in me thinks that maybe there will be enough grassroots support for that sort of thing that nothing terrible has to happen before we see something like that in place.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have any questions?
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your attendance and for your interest in esports. You can certainly, to come up and talk to us afterwards if you have a specific interest or a specific question. And if you want to just play some games, you can always find us online.
Right. If you also want to follow what we're doing on Facebook, we do more than just esports. I mean, yes, Andrew and I are both huge geeks. I mean, I play D&D once a week, but we're also on Facebook. It's Legal Ease Podcast. Yeah, it's Legal-Ease EASE Podcast.
You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch. Look up the VOD here if you want to go over anything again, if you want to see my beautiful face.
I'm sorry. The pizza I had for lunch isn't sitting well with me.
All right, thank you all.